Hi, everybody. This is Jessica Trimble, and I'm Director of Communication and Outreach here at Indiana Disability Rights. And today we are talking with one of our senior attorneys, Keith Butler, about returning to school and education during COVID-19. So with that, I will throw it to Keith, let him talk a little bit about himself, and then we're just going to dig right into the questions.
Hi, so like Jess said, I'm a senior attorney at IDR. I'm the attorney over the employment and education teams. I do primarily education cases. I've been at IDR, I think, for about 10 years now.
So something we wanted to make sure you all knew is we are taping this the morning of Friday, July 24th. So everything that we're going to talk about today is current as of that moment. And we are going to do our best to keep up with updates, but this, as we all know, education during 2020 for the fall semester is an ever-changing landscape. So please keep that in mind as you are watching this, that this is current as of July 24th in the morning. We know things can change in the afternoon, so I think it's even imperative to make sure people know what time of day it is. I know Keith has been staying on top of everything coming out at the local and state level to give you the most up-to-date information. So with that, we're going to start our questions. And today I'm going to warn you, I'm going to be doing a lot of reading because this topic is really challenging to cover, and we want to make sure we give you the best information. So I have my questions prepared. So if you see me reading, you'll know why. I want to make sure I say the right things and get this right. So Keith, we did an interview all the way back in May, which seems a lifetime ago at this point in time. How has your work been impacted since we talked then with COVID-19 and closures and things like that?
Well, so just from an office standpoint, obviously we're still home. So like we were saying earlier, I can't guarantee that either a cat or a child won't wander into the background while we're talking. As far as actually like, working education cases, we've had advocates in our office go to case conference virtually. I've actually been pretty surprised by how well that's worked, that, assuming everybody has the right technology, that hasn't seemed to be, a big issue for people who've done a mediation virtually, which I was skeptical about going into, but it worked out pretty well. So, I definitely think there's a lot of things as far as just an advocacy standpoint that can be done virtually. I don't think it's ideal. I still think people sitting around a conference room face to face is a lot of times the best way to get things done. But I think it's something that we can deal with from just how we do our teamwork. So.
All right. So before we dive into the COVID conversation, let's just talk about what we normally talk about this time of year. We like to talk about getting back to school and how we as parents or guardians or family members can prepare with our student to go back to the school year.
Yeah, so I think there's, in some ways it isn't, terribly different than in other years. Like you want to kind of do some basic things to get ready. If your student has an IEP or 504 plan, you probably want to find that plan, look it over, see if you have any questions. As we've talked about a lot, has probably changed, and as we'll get into more, the reopening plans might impact whether your IEP can even make sense or not at this point. So I think all of those kind of like things, find all your documents, read through them is definitely the first thing I would recommend. And then if you're looking at it and it just seems out of date, either because the students changed grade levels or it was switched from, say, elementary to middle school or something like that, and for whatever reason it hasn't been updated since then, or with something with COVID and reopening, it just doesn't seem to make sense. Like you're starting virtually or whatever the case may be. If for some reason something in the plan doesn't make sense, obviously the best step would be to call for a case conference as a parent or a student over 18, you have that right to call a case conference. So I think that would be the first step. As far as just other kind of like general advice, sometimes it's good to, if it's, you have a new resource teacher or gen ed teachers, and there's a student with particular needs, to try and talk to them before school starts. I normally recommend for a lot of students to try and take a tour of the building, maybe not during like just sort of like and again, this is pre-COVID, and we'll sort of like translate it to COVID, like normally there's like this one time when like the entire school population comes in, and you can sign up for things, and there's kind of like chaos, but maybe just see if you can arrange time to go at other times. I mean, I don't know if those types of events will even take place this year, but try and get a tour of the building if that's something they're worried about. Look at the classroom. I think as a special ed students, you would probably should be given that flexibility to do that at an off time. And then obviously if you're starting virtually, you're not touring the school building, doesn't really make sense, but see if you can look at the equipment. Is it accessible? If there's like a blind, low vision, hard of hearing or deaf type issue, is it accessible to that student? Obviously in March, there wasn't a lot of time to kind of plan for virtual and to make things accessible. I think now there has been that time, so I think it's okay to kind of put higher demands on making sure that everything's accessible. So I mean, those are just kind of some general back to school thoughts that I had.
Sure. So I know that we all are watching our school districts and trying to see what's happening. When are we starting? Is it virtual? Is it in person? Is it a hybrid mix? So as we're watching these school plans unfold, how does that impact special education law?
So from like a big picture, like you might hear about, like there's CDC guidance, there's like the state has a reopening plan called in class that was a combination of the Department of Health, Department of Ed, and we're talking about Indiana specifically now, since this is going out onto the web. So there's like state level guidance, there's federal level guidance, and in general, those are just guidance. So you have to, like I think as you said, go to the actual school district plan for the actual plan, right? So I think there's one exception, which we'll get into more, in that, again, as of this morning, we know there is going to be an order from the governor mandating mask usage. Obviously, that's not guidance, that's an actual order. We can kind of get into that later. But so in general, all these like higher level, state level, federal level are guidance. You have to go to the individual school district for the actual plan. But it's important to note that a school district can't like overrule rules on like 504 plans, IEPs. All these are federal legislation that would supersede individual school plan, COVID-related reopening plans. So in other words, you still have, there still is a requirement to do an IEP, to have it individualized to the student, have accommodations for that student, have access to education, have goals, all those sort of things that are normally in an IEP or a 504 plan. That there are still all those requirements. So.
Okay, so no matter how we're going back, we still need to get either updated IEPs, 504 plans. So I am going to assume most people's plans have been written for an in-person situation. So how are these different back to school plans impacting IEPs and 504s, and what should we be doing with these different options, I guess?
Well, I think one thing to look at is, when was your plan updated? I mean, hopefully a lot of these plans were updated in the spring, since we've been, in sort of this virtual setting, so that they should take some things into account. If they haven't, I mean, I think that's sort of the first step, is, does this even sort of like make sense under your current environment? And look at what, I guess, changes have been, with the school reopening plan. Are there things that just, you're worried about whether that would work for your student with their disability related needs, and it does maybe conflict with an IEP. And if it does, again, I think that's kind of when you might want to look at calling a case conference.
So you talked about the spring a little bit, which seems, again, a really long time ago. But we definitely have had people asking, saying, my student didn't get the services they needed in the spring, and now I'm really concerned that they're behind. So what steps do I need to take to catch them back up, or kind of to get back on track for this new school year?
I think the first thing to do is to, as best you can, quantify how they're behind. So is it in academic subject, were they struggling with doing math virtually and they didn't learn, something with math that they're supposed to learn in the spring, they just are behind on that? Is it an actual IEP goal? They didn't make progress on their IEP goal either because it was difficult to do virtually, or the service just wasn't even provided, like didn't have access to a physical therapist or an occupational therapist or speech or whatever the case may be, or social skills, something that was in the IEP that, couldn't be done or wasn't done in the spring. So, is that why they're behind? Is there like a social deficit? If you're talking about the autism or some other disability that has maybe a social component, and they haven't been around, their friends or classmates and 6 months or however long it's been, is that what's causing the person to be behind? And so I think that's the first thing, is to be able to really kind of quantify what it is. And then this is going to sound familiar, but then, ask for a case conference and come up with a plan to catch the student back up. Is that sort of extra services on top of what's just normally written in the IEP? And I think the goal should be to catch the student up to where they would be like now if this had never happened. I mean, I think that's the ideal goal to ask for, at least as a starting point. To not just sort of catch them up to where they would have been, like 3 months ago or 4 months ago, but like literally catch them up so they're at grade level now, at which, might, depending on how far behind they are, might take some time, but I think that's the goal.
So when it's talking about, my child being behind, what I'm hearing you say is be as specific as possible. Don't just say, well, my kid's behind and they're not where they should be, but be very specific about what that means, what you've noticed, in, like you said, in many different capacities or facets or areas.
Yes.
Okay. So now that we're looking towards the fall semester, whatever that will be, we also have parents who are concerned that their student has an underlying health condition that puts them at greater risk of COVID than maybe other students. So what are the options for students, and who should families contact about their concerns to talk about these things?
Yeah, so I think one good thing with this situation, from sort of like a strictly legal situation, again, not saying it's an easy thing if you're a student that's more vulnerable to COVID, but just from a strictly legal standpoint, is this isn't really a new situation, right? I mean, there are, obviously been, compromised students before, somebody had oncology or organ transplant, or I mean, whatever you can think of where they really can't be around other students because they might get sick from them. So this is something that is, I think, pretty established in law and contemplated before. So as far as practical steps, I think the first thing I would do is to see if the school has a virtual option. I mean, I know a lot of schools have, you can pick between virtual and in class, and is the virtual option something that sort of works for you and your situation? I mean, I think just because you have a student that's more prone to COVID doesn't mean you have to take that option. Like I said, this having a virtual option doesn't sort of like overrule all the other accommodations and things that are in special ed law. But does that work for you? If it does, that might be just a very straightforward fix. If you don't think it does, I think the first conversation to have is with your doctor and get something in writing from the doctor about what the doctor feels the restrictions are. What the student can and can't do, what the more specific the better. So and then I'm sure they'll be shocked to hear this. I think the next step after that would be to go ahead and call for a case conference. And again, your student has a right to, from a general standpoint, for free appropriate public education, whether they can sort of like attend in person or not, and if their disability is preventing them from attending under special ed law, there's a requirement to have a setting where they can access free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment that's kind of like feasible under these situations. So again, so go to the doctor, see what specific restrictions the doctor has, call a case conference, and see if you can work out a plan under those with those conditions.
Okay, so talking about going back to school, going back in person. So what if I'm a parent or guardian and I'm worried about my student with a disability being suspended or expelled for behaviors when they go back to school? What are the rules or laws around school discipline for students with disabilities?
Can I go? Sorry, I left out something. I just realized on the other one, I'll go back and I'll get to discipline. But
sure.
With COVID, it might be that, I said call a case conference. Well, maybe you're saying, well, but I don't have an IEP. Like, there could be people that didn't ever have any sort of plan or IEP or 504 plan or whatever the case may be before this. In that case, obviously the first step would be, send an email or letter, phone call, something. I would definitely recommend it be in writing to, special ed director, somebody in the school asking for an evaluation, get them eligible, and then they'd be entitled to the services.
Okay, so I think that's great. So, okay, so if my child has not had an IEP or a 504, because maybe it hasn't been necessary yet, but now with the changing environment, as my child is now got greater concerns about their health and safety, so I need to get that established. So I need to email, you said do it in writing is better, email, write a letter, contact the special ed director, and ask for an evaluation.
Yeah, that's yes.
Okay.
I would say that's the best way to do it.
And me being the type of person I am, what I would probably do is probably do a phone call and an email, because I know sometimes it's easier to talk some things out. So you let me know if I'm wrong, but I would probably end up calling and then sending an email saying per our conversation. So that way I'm actually talking to the person, but I still have it in writing.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, so I think phone call is definitely the best way to transmit information. An email, sort of with my attorney mind, is the best way to kind of timestamp when you've asked for it and when sort of deadlines start. So I think you're right. The combination of the two kind of gets everything done. So.
I have learned something working with the attorneys at IDR. I have learned a lot about tracking and keeping records. So so people are teachable, that's for sure. No, but that was such a good, I'm glad that that's so important, because I think that's for a lot of people that are students or employees, that there might be disabilities that you didn't need to disclose before or didn't prevent your safety or impact certain daily activities, that now during COVID, things are different, and those might be issues that you need to discuss now. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. So we'll backtrack to the question I asked, move forward. So again, the question was, I'm worried about my student with a disability being suspended or expelled for behaviors when they go back to school in person. What are the rules or laws around school discipline for students with disabilities?
Yeah, so a lot of, I guess, as context, a lot of students with disabilities there's some sort of, behavior component to the disability. And from a very broad level, if you have a behavior that's disability related, the sort of legal term is manifestation, which means caused by or substantially related to, not to get too into the weeds legally, but a behavior that's a manifestation of your disability, then you shouldn't be removed for school for that disability, right? Because you have a right to free, appropriate public education. If you're being removed for something that's disability related, then obviously you're not getting free, appropriate public education. So there's this whole system of laws under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is like the law that establishes IEPs on how to deal with that. So the big component of that is you cannot be removed for more than 10 days. There's a cumulative or consecutive component, which I think we don't really need to get into, but basically if you've been out of school for 10 days for disciplinary reasons, beyond that, the school can't suspend you or expel you for that. So in other words, they have to come up with some other plan besides school discipline for dealing with those behaviors. I would say if it's been less than 10 days, while they could still technically suspend you or expel you, there's probably an indication that their sort of behavior plan, their plan for handling the student's behavior might not be adequate, because it's certainly not ideal to be suspending or expelling somebody. So it might not technically violate the manifestation rules, but there might need to be a better behavior plan. So that's kind of like at a high level. And then when you get into COVID, I think there's a big concern with a lot of people is that, if there was a behavior issue before, then suddenly spending 6 months at home quarantined and then going straight back into school, like your behaviors aren't likely to get better in that situation. They might get worse. So I think there's sort of this, anticipation that there might be behavior related concerns. So, I mean, again, I think having communication with the school beforehand, do we need to update sort of like the terms are, there's a FDA, which is a functional behavior assessment, that this assessment that creates what's called a behavior improvement plan, where that's how kind of like the plan for dealing with these behaviors. And the key, and it's in the law, and it makes sense from a practical standpoint, is rather than sort of treating these like disciplinary issues to handle them with what's called positive behavioral support interventions. So treat it as a disability related issue with sort of positive supports rather than as a disciplinary issue, which like I said is there's a legal aspect to it, but I think obviously makes sense from just a practical level as well. So yeah, like I said, this applies beyond COVID, but I think it could be important as kids go back to school, just to kind of have all these concepts in mind.
Yeah, I think going back to school in person, it's going to be challenging for every student because our students have just been out of their routines and out of their schedules for so long that it's going to be an interesting school year. But it's good to know that, like you said, those laws are already in place before COVID existed. So those are still going to be consistent, and those expectations for what the school can and can't do are going to be the same as they were before. All right, so we're going to move on to another question that is, at least I've been seeing it in a lot of family message boards and things on social media, seems like a lot of families are concerned that their child with a disability won't be able to use a mask safely or keep it on for long periods of time. How should families begin this discussion about their concerns with their school?
Yeah, and maybe it's like context. I know Jesse and I were talking about this before. Like, as an agency, like we're pro mask, right? Like, I wear a mask when I go to the grocery store. We've had staff meetings on, we're going to have advocates probably at some point go back into facilities and do all the work that they do in person. And we've had, PPE discussions and, right. I mean, so there's no sort of like, none of this is like an argument sort of against, general use of masks, right? I mean, I think that's sort of like important to kind of like point out to begin with. But just sort of like an analogy I was thinking about is, I'm a parent of a student with autism, right? And he has a lot of sensory issues around eating, which is, certainly not unusual for students with autism. So, right, so if you're a parent of autism, maybe you relate to this. Like, you're going to go to grandma's house, and grandma has her famous tuna casserole that she always serves, and everybody in the family eats the tuna casserole and tells grandma how much they love the casserole, right? Well, if you have a student with autism, maybe you have another student or child, and you just tell the kid, look, I don't know if tuna casserole is your favorite or not, but grandma loves this tuna casserole. It's important to her. You eat the tuna casserole, and if you don't like it, pretend like you do, and that's just how we're going to handle this, right? Which might make sense for that kid. Now, if you have a child with autism with eating issues, eating this tuna casserole is kind of, I think, as my wife likes to put it, it'd be like the seventh circle of hell for that student to eat this casserole, because, right, they have sensory issues around food, and it's not going to happen. So the child is not that like they're being disrespectful. They're not like they're trying to, don't have an appreciation for social norms, any of these sort of things. They just, that eating the casserole is not going to go well, right? So that's kind of, if you would sort of like translate that to people with sensory issues or disability related behavior issues around masks, I think that's like the situation we're talking about, right? So we're not sort of as context as we get into it. So from a legal standpoint, it's a little tough because, well, first of all, this is the first global pandemic that we've had since all these special ed laws have been created, or disability laws in general. So exactly how they interact with each other hasn't ever sort of been tested. And it's tough from the standpoint of there are, in that narrow situation, there are sort of competing or potentially competing legal interests. So on one hand, there's a public health benefit to people wearing masks, and that's important, obviously, during a pandemic, to have good public health policy. And then there's also powerful interest for a student to be able to access free appropriate public education, and if they can't access that because they can't wear a mask, then that they have like a legal right to do that as well. So so that's kind of like the broad area where we're at, and like how those sort of two interests, I don't want to get too in the weeds from like a legal standpoint, how they sort of like would get resolved legally, I don't think is very well established, particularly here in Indiana, where the governor has announced a mask mandate, but we haven't actually, at least as of this morning, seen. We believe there's going to be some sort of exceptions to it, probably things like health, or you don't have to wear the mask when you're eating lunch at school, but for students third grade and up, there is going to be like a mask requirement at schools, and we don't know exactly how the exceptions are worded. So I feel like it's a really long way of getting into what I think are kind of more practical steps to handling this, but I kind of wanted to get through all that background. So the first thing I would do is look at, I guess, when it is actually in writing, which as of right now, I don't think that it has been, the executive order on mask wearing and your school's mask policy, and see if that, not just from like a theoretical level, but an actual practical level, is there an actual conflict? So in other words, if you have a second grade student and the governor's policy only applies to third grade and up, well then, you don't need to worry about it. And I know school policies, I mean, they're probably all over the board, but I've seen at least a few that do take disability into account, and there are sort of disability related exceptions beyond like health, right? And beyond just, I can't breathe through the mask, but is this a student that has like a sensory issue to it? There are processes for that. Look at, obviously, is there like a, generally the policy is going to have a medical exemption. Is there an actual medical reason why the student could wear a mask? I would look at that. Um, and again, I think looking at the policy and seeing when the mask use is actually required. So in other words, maybe your student having a mask on for like, 8 straight hours is a problem, but in reality, they're not going to be required to under the actual policy. So, things like that. And then, so once you've kind of done that homework and I would also look at, and maybe to the extent you can talk to your child and see sort of what their limit is, like, and try and talk them into, if you can go out and practice wearing it, outside of the grocery store, and maybe it's not as big of an issue as you thought it was. I would definitely try and do all those steps beforehand. But so if you've gone through all that, you still think it's an issue, again, go to the case conference, call a case conference, and just talk it through it with everybody. And I think one thing, with the case conference, you, I guess, might not immediately think of is that, there's the school should have, an occupational therapist. They should have maybe people that can do social stories. There are these sort of like other tools that might be just sort of like outside the norm of like either you wear the mask or you don't, right? They can maybe create a face shield, for example, that maybe the occupational therapist and the student could like work on it together and put stickers on it or something, and that might take care of some of the problems. So again, just really when you get to this case conference, I would say try and be as collaborative as possible. Look for solutions. Like, are there ways maybe, and again, this might change once this executive order comes out, but are there ways to kind of like socially distance the student in the school, in the classroom, where they don't have to wear the mask all the time? Again, looking at the policies, looking at the executive order, and see if that's even possible under those. Do all those things. At the case conference, I say look at all the resources possible and really try to get to a solution. There is, I think, a potential legal argument, like we said at the beginning, in that these federal laws of IDEA, the law that creates IEPs, 504s, I think would supersede state law. But there is this problem with a lot of these have exceptions for fundamental alteration. To use a ADA term, where you can't sort of like fundamentally alter the state rule, and I think they're, so I don't know exactly how it would come out. I think it'd be very fact specific. If you sort of get into like a litigation situation. So I guess the bottom line is really try hard to to come up with some sort of solution, working collaboratively at the case conference. If that's not possible, I think there's at least a theoretical argument out there beyond that, but I don't know exactly how that would play out at this point. Obviously, not even having read the Indiana executive order at this point. So it's a really, really long answer. Sorry about that, but I think it's kind of like important to go through all those things.
Well, and I think, from my time at IDR, what I've learned from all the attorneys and advocates, especially in education, is every student is unique. Every student's needs are unique, and there is no magic wand that just fits for everybody. So I think my takeaways have always been, so correct me if I'm wrong, is make sure you have an open dialogue with your school. Keep those lines of communication open, which I know is, again, the world is weird right now, so that's difficult. Have a case conference, and keep talking. If you need support, contact Indiana Disability Rights. We'll make sure we have all of our information, contact information below in the description of the video. But call us if you have questions. You don't have to wait until everything goes haywire to call us. If you just want to clarify something, if you just have some questions, because these are murky waters that are really difficult for non-attorneys and non-advocates to navigate in pre-COVID times. So COVID just adds a whole nother layer of complexity. So call our intake advocates, Dan and Mary, talk to them, because we're here to support you. We're here to help you understand these complex things and how they work for your student. So that's been my takeaway from my time at IDR, and especially now. Did I kind of cover some basics, Keith? Is that an okay?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. I think that sounds great. Yep.
So I think we covered everything we planned on covering today. We know this is a long one, but we know it's really important, as they all are, but this is really, with the timing of school, you know, we're all just trying to figure out what's going to happen. So we're actually I'm going to get this video out as soon as possible. We will follow up with a transcript and closed captioning as soon as I get them back, but I want to make sure this video is available. So if you have questions about what we discussed today, if you want to give us a call, our number at Indiana Disability Rights is 1-800-622-4845. And again, I'll put that below. I'll also put our email address, and I will put a link to our online help form. So please, families, call us. We know these are challenging times, and we want to help you and your student get what you need to be successful. So with that, Keith, thank you for spending so much time with me today. Thank you for spending so much time preparing for this interview. I was sharing before, this is the interview I think I have worked on the most to prepare for. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to add? I'm sure it's a see you later, because we'll probably be doing this again in a few days.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, everything changes all the time, but you know, like I said, it's since this isn't like one statewide law, you have to kind of really look at your individual school district, and your student has a right to an individualized plan. And so if those, you know, look at that, and then yeah, nothing with COVID overturns all the laws that have been passed to protect kids with special, you know, with special needs. So I think it's probably the biggest thing to keep in mind. But yes, thanks. I'm definitely glad we did this. So thank you, Jess.
I know. Thank you for being on. And as usual, thank you to Amy and Bethany, our interpreters. We're so happy that you were able to be here and join us. So with that, I'm going to say see you later, because I'm sure you're going to be seeing these faces again in the next few days as things change and progress, and we will do our best to get as much information out to you all as possible. But again, don't hesitate to call or email us. We are here to help.